we have learned about the median voter theorem and about the spatial model of politics. And we made all sorts of assumptions about political ideology and underlying dimensions. But of course, the question is, that's a theoretical model, but we need to test it empirically. We need to think about how does this relate to sort of the empirical real world? Can we measure these kinds of things? Is there such a thing as a sort of latent underlying dimension? So that's what we need to talk about. And I had asked you to place political parties in your home country, for example, on a left-right scale. And I think all of you were able to do that, hopefully by now, which is very good, a testament to the fact that we have some sort of knowledge about how this works. But maybe we can make this more systematic. So is there a way to measure the positions of political actors, of voters, parties, congressmen, etc.? I made assumptions about, I showed you the graph with the US Senator. Is there some way to get at this, to actually identify the locations of these people? How did I know that the Joe Manchin character is the pivotal voter? So we need to think about this more systematically. So maybe what I would recommend is, again, pause the video for a second and just think for a second about how can we measure this? How can we get at sort of identifying the ideology of political actors, of voters or politicians, senators, parties, etc.? So take a second and think about it first before you move on. Did you come up with some mechanisms to identify positions of political actors? There are many ways to do this. One of the things maybe some of you have come across is these kinds of websites where you can answer some questions and they spit out some position in the ideological space. And you can also answer this for parties, for example. And sometimes there are these vote advice applications, even, for example, that tell you how much you agree with certain parties before an election. I think this is very clever. But this also relates to how in surveys, for example, we can ask the ideology of people, not by asking them, okay, where would you place yourself on a left-right scale, which is done and possible, of course, but perhaps a bit difficult to answer, but by asking sort of concrete questions that we think relate to the underlying sort of ideological dimension. So survey-based measures we can use, but there are some other methods that we can use to identify the ideology of, for example, political actors. One of the methods to get at sort of the positions of parties in an ideological space is using a method that is actually quite similar to what you've done for your first homework task. I asked you to identify for all parties in parliament in a country that you know well to where they stand on a left-right scale. And this is essentially eliciting expert judgments. You know something about the country, so therefore you can place parties in an ideological space because you have been reading the news and you're familiar with the country context. And this is essentially what the Chapel Hill Expert Survey does. It asks country expert political scientists to place parties in an ideological continuum, and this works really well. There are, however, other methods as well. One of the sort of workhorse methods for estimating party positions uses manifesto data. Basically, parties before elections publish manifestos, and there they say certain policies that they want to implement, and they wax lyrically about the society they want to achieve. And then there's basically methods to estimate party positions from this, either through human coding or through machine learning sort of text analysis methods. And one of the biggest projects for this kind of analysis is the Comparative Manifesto project that has party positions for 1,200 parties in 60 countries and 700 something or 800 elections across the world. So I'd recommend you having a look if you're interested in where parties are located according to the Manifesto project located in your home country. And we can look quickly at the UK results for this. So a couple of years ago, I went and downloaded the comparative Manifesto project data for the UK, and I plotted the Conservative and Labour Party here. And you can see basically the evolution from the bottom 1945 to this ends in 2010. I haven't updated it since then. It shows the positions of the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. And you can see, for example, the new Labour, Labour Party moving to the right for the 1997 election. So just sort of eyeballing this, it seems to recover what we know about party positions intuitively as well. But there are other methods to get at the positions of either parties, or in the US case, even individual legislators such as senators. And the workhorse model for this is using so-called roll call votes. And these are all distance-based methods. I'll explain that in a second. So basically, these Poole and Rosenthal's DW nominate scores, what they do is they look at all the votes that these senators, for example, take, and the underlying assumption is that, of course, people who have similar ideological predispositions will vote together on more issues than people who are further apart. So there are many bills and many votes in Congress, and as a consequence, people vote together if they share support for a bill, for example, and they vote against it together if they share opposition. But if they are ideologically distinct, they will be on different sides of the vote, of course. And the more frequently people vote together, the close they should be ideologically, and the further apart, the less frequently they vote together, the further apart they should be. And then you can use a multidimensional scaling algorithm, a method to see whether there's some underlying dimension in this large matrix of voted together, didn't vote together, and find these underlying dimensions. And these Poole and Rosenthal's DW nominate scores are sort of the standard measure for ideology in US politics. And that's where I got my estimate for Joe Manchin from earlier. That's how I know that he's the sort of the swing, or the pivotal senator. And again, you can have a look at the website and look at the Senate, for example, over time, or the Congress over time. And for example, you can see the increasing polarization of American politics over the last 50 years or so. But this idea of distance-based measures can be extended to other contexts. Basically, it's all based on this very clever idea that if people vote together, if people do something together, if you can create sort of a big matrix, how close or far apart individual legislators or other political actors are, then you can use this sort of distance matrix, this knowledge about relative proximity, to see whether there is some latent dimension that explains the distribution of these in some one or two or n-dimensional space. And this can be used for other contexts than votes as well. So, for example, there's a very clever paper that uses basically donations, campaign donations, to get at the ideological distribution of different industries. And so if you want to know which kind of industries are more right-wing or more left-wing or something like this, you can look at basically donations to candidates. And so the industries that give more money to right-wing candidates should be more right-wing, and the industries that give more money to left-wing candidates should be more left-wing. And you can see academics on the first place, they tend to give to left-wing politicians, and the oil and gas and coal industry gives to right-wing politicians. So no surprises here. Okay, again, sort of using relative proximity to get at ideological similarity. And we can even use Twitter to get at ideological positions. There is a paper and a bunch of follow-up work by Pablo Barbera that basically uses the idea that people who sound alike on Twitter, who tweet the same kinds of words, they're going to be probably closer to each other ideologically than people who use very different terms. Republicans and Democrats in the US context, for example, use different language. They say different things. And if you run enough of this data basically through a text analysis algorithm, you can get proximity measures for people based on their Twitter account. So this is from the 2016 election. I haven't seen an updated version for 2020, but for the 2016 election, this is a nice example of sort of where politicians are located based on their Twitter score. I would assume, and it is possible to recover something that very much looks like what we would expect in terms of ideological distribution. So the average Twitter user is in the middle here. It's gray distribution, and you have Republican congressmen on the right and Democrat members of Congress on the left, and you have sort of the estimates for the individual Twitter accounts. And Trump in the 2016 or in the primaries, I think it is not actually that far to the right. So I would wager the guess that if we were to rerun this with the sort of latest shouting until he got shut down, Trump probably would have moved to the further to the right than most of these other accounts over the course of his presidency. So it is possible to recover ideological estimates in real time based on the Twitter data. And you can extend this type of analysis, of course, also to the multi-party context in European politics, where you have for example, party locations based on Twitter estimates. And this table here compares the estimates based on Twitter to the Chapel expert survey estimates. And it kind of actually matches up quite nicely. So it is possible to recover the underlying sort of latent ideology of parties based on the stuff they tweet. The last brief homework exercise I would like you to engage in concerns measuring ideology in a survey. Imagine you had the opportunity to ask some survey questions to voters, randomly sampled voter, and in order to place them on either economic left-right or an authoritarian liberal kind of social scale. What would you ask them? So try to think a little bit about this and come up with at least two questions, one for the economic left-right and one for the liberal authoritarian kind of scale, and post them on the homework and vote up good ideas from your classmates. Asking people for self-placement, where would you place yourself on a 0 to 10 scale, is definitely possible. It is done a lot. Many surveys contain these data, and it is used a lot. Guilty as charged here as well. But while you may think it is easy to do that, to self-place on an ideological scale, if you think about where the parties are, for example, and then locate yourself, it is not normal for most people. You should be aware that you're very weird, and you can Google what a weird sample looks like. Okay, WEIRD. And many people, of course, give rather odd answers. Most people are not political economy students. So maybe shoot for something more practical that gets at this underlying issues in a more practical or policy-based way that people have actual opinions on.